All right, everyone. So in the last couple of videos, we talked about various ways of doing selections by using marquee tools, which are, selecting basing on, rectangles and circles, the lasso, which gives us kind of alternative ways of doing that. The one thing that all of those tools really have in common is that they're all really based on hand movement. All right. Meaning like you literally move your hand and that is, part of the act of selecting. The next couple next couple of selection tools I'm going to show you, they're less about your hand movement and more about aspects of the image itself and more specifically color. Okay. So I have this is exercise 6, and I have a apple, okay? And I could, I don't think using like a, elliptical or a marquee would necessarily be the greatest tool. You could try using a lasso or, maybe the magnetic lasso of these tools might be the best. But another thing to kind of look at here is, well, this is all one color, right? It's an apple. It's mostly red, right? So what I'm going to do is actually click and hold. It probably looks like this. I'm going to click and hold, and I'm going to choose the last option here called the Magic Wand tool. Okay. Why is it called the Magic Wand tool? Well, what happens is rather than drawing out a selection, what this will do is choose a pixel and then kind of go out from all directions and then try to select similar colored pixels. So in other words, if I click on a red pixel, it's going to try to go out in all directions and select similar colored pixels, which in this case would be red. Okay. So let's try that out. I'm going to be here in the middle and I'm going to click. And you can see automatically I didn't, what happened here is I didn't draw that. It literally just got created by me using the Magic Wand tool, right? This is very, so what happened here? Well, and th this kind of begs the question like, all right, it selected all those pixels. Why didn't it select all of the red pixels? Why are these red pixels not being affected? And why are these red pixels not being affected? And that's a good question. And the answer to that we're going to go back to the concept of luminance. But really, what it is at its core is like, well, when you talk about color, if you've ever like tried to paint a room by going to like Home Depot or some, Benjamin Moore or something like that, you should know that there's no such thing as like red paint or blue paint or, green paint. There's all these variations of it, right? So even with red, it's like, well, there's kind of like the darker red here, and there's like kind of this brighter red where the light source is kind of bouncing off of it, right? And then there's kind of these midtones. Okay. So what I'm actually doing is I'm kind of clicking here and selecting kind of the midtone. And so it went out and got other kind of midtone reds, but it's not really getting the really brights and it's not really getting the really darks. Okay. So let's kind of show this a little bit. So we talked about the idea of luminance, bright areas, dark areas, and I actually mentioned that the way most graphic design programs, like raster programs, work when it comes to luminance is they usually measure it from 0, meaning pure darkness or lack of light, to 255, which is absolute light. Okay. So something that's pure brightness is like 255, that might be like that. And a pure darkness, I don't know if any of these are pure dark, maybe like right there. That would be like a 0. Okay. Now and everything else is kind of along the line. So like an off gray, like maybe like this is like, 190, 160, 180, something like that. So what does that have to do with anything? Well, when you use the magic wand tool, there's this thing called tolerance. Tolerance in this case means how many variations of luminance above and below your magic wand will pick up. So let's just say for the sake of argument, that I choose a red that's kind of in the middle for this apple, right? And let's just say for the sake of argument, on the level of luminance, it's like a 150. It's kind of in between everything. If you have a tolerance of 32, that means it's going to select 32 variations that are brighter than this and 32 variations that are darker than this. Now, you'll notice that does not get the full line, so I'm not getting these, which are much darker versions of this color, and I'm not getting brighter or, lighter versions of this, which would be like the brighter versions. And you can kind of see that right here. Where it's like, I didn't get the really dark pixels or the dark reds, and I didn't get the really, really bright reds. How do I solve this problem? Well, you could increase the number of variations you include. So if I increase the tolerance and I go back, I don't remember the exact spot, but I'm going to try to click roughly where it was. You can see that I'm getting a bigger selection here. Okay. So the more variations that I allow, the bigger is the selection. And once again, this is all based on the color of the image. I don't control that. That's just from the data of the image. So it's not based on my hand movement at all. It's all based off the color information that's in the actual photograph. Now I could hold down shift and try to increase how much I'm getting here. So this is selecting based on color rather than being based on my hand movement. I'm going to deselect and I'm going to click and hold and we're going to grab the quick selection tool. Now the quick selection tool is a little different in that it's you yourself have to do a little bit of work, but it's still based on color. So what happens with this is you get a brush and if I drag, you can see I'm making a selection here. Okay. This is the size of your brush. So if I click on this, I get all these brush options, but I'm going to be honest, the only one that really matters for this particular tool is the size, making your brush size bigger or making your brush size smaller. You don't want it too big, you don't want it too small in relationship to the thing that you're trying to select. And as I click and drag out, you can see how I'm like pulling it out. And what happens is eventually it kind of samples the color and it realizes the colors that I'm looking for. And it actually selects the entire apple. Okay. And once again, this is based off of the colors. Had this not been a solid color apple, maybe it's like a bunch of colors, this would have been harder to do. So it's kind of a little bit of a combination of the Magic Wand tool and that it's based on color, but also based on the movement of your hand and selecting colors. Another way to do this is if I were to use the object selection. Essentially, what object selection does is it kind of is like an automatic quick selection where if you click and drag over an object in a layer, it's going to sample those colors and figure out what areas are the most congruent. So for instance, if I do this, it goes, oh, this apple is the most important thing here. It's the biggest, it's the most consistent with color, and then it's going to go around the edges. So it seems almost like magic, but really what it's doing is looking for color and organizing colors together. Okay. All right, so those are the three tools there, the Magic Wand tool, quick selection, and the object selection, all based off color and luminance that are inside of your document. Let's go to exercise 7. And one thing I just want to kind of get across is the idea that you don't actually have to use just one selection tool when you make a selection. So for instance, if I click and, I have this kind of awkward shape here, and I deliberately made it awkward so that it would be hard to use just one specific selection tool to accomplish what we're doing. So we're going to kind of break this down where it's like, all right, here's this area. This is an easy rectangle. So something like wait for it, rectangular marquee might be really good for, wait for it, selecting a rectangle. So I'm going to click on that, click and drag. All right, I get that. Now, obviously, a rectangle isn't great for selecting this next part, but it would be maybe using like the elliptical tool. Now, this is the point that's important. Normally, you're probably set to replace, which means whatever selection tool would replace whatever new selection would replace the old one. I want to make sure this is set to add, okay? And now it's going to add to my current selection. So I'm going to click and I'm going to use option here so it adds to my current selection. Okay, I was a little bit off there. You can kind of, Command Z or Control Z to kind of play around with this. That's a little better. Maybe like a little bit over here. There we go. Getting there. All right. So I added that. I can play around with this, maybe a lasso tool or something. But you can see how I kind of added that. So now I have this much more complex selection there. Now I want to do this last part. I could maybe try a magnetic, but actually, see how these are like super linear, like straight lines? You know what's really good for that might be like the polygonal. So maybe I'm gonna be like, all right, oops, except I set to, let me undo that. I'm gonna make sure this is set to add, and then I'm gonna go back and kind of do this and go around my shape. Okay, close it up. And there you go. There's my nice complex shape. All right. So my point here is sometimes I see students try to like, use one tool to solve every part of the selection problem, and you really don't need to do that. You just need to understand the various selection tools. We didn't even go over every selection tool, but these are some of the more major ones that you're able to use and be like, okay, how, based off the information in my image, what should I do? Should I, would it make sense to use a more, more geometric shape, like a circle or a square? Would it make more sense to have more linear sides? Maybe if I was going around like a building or a box, or maybe it's something a little bit more organic. Maybe that magnetic lasso tool would have been a good choice, or a lasso tool. Or maybe it's something that's based on color, and maybe that would be very helpful. So there's a lot of, you got to think about what's the best way to tackle this. Okay. All right. I want you guys to try that out. That was exercise 6 and 7, please.